Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Academies Benchmark Report 2023. It's hard to believe that we're already into February, but we'll need to cast our minds back to the 31st of August sets of accounts and some of the data included in it. Can we go to the first slide, please? So I suppose before we get going, let's do a quick introduction. My name's Darren O'Connor and I'm one of the partners here at James Cooper Kreston. And for my sins, I am also the head of Academies. I'm joined today by Becky Foy, one of our senior managers who works with a number of academies and is also an expert in the field. So as an introduction, the Kreston Academies Benchmark Report is based on over 320 trusts, 2,400 schools, which tends to increase year on year. It covers off all of the academies under the Kreston umbrella. For those of you that are not aware, Kreston is a network of accountancy firms, of which we are one, and there are a number of others across the UK. For the first time this year, we've also included some data on some of the larger trusts outside of the Kreston network, just to give a fair representation of the sector. So as I said, it's based on the 31st of August sets of accounts. Within the data, we analyse it between primary, secondary and maths. And this year we have made it pretty clear in terms of the maths that it's split down into three subsections. And I'll go into more detail in a little while. Benchmarking is a great starting point in terms of assessing your academy against others. You can benchmark yourself and compare yourself against other academies in your region and also nationwide. But I always say it comes with a word of caution. It will only ever be the starting point to start conversation, to provoke and generate thoughts, but it won't give you all the answers. Over onto the next page, please. So how to interpret the data? Hopefully you have seen the benchmark report, and if not, there's a link to it at the end. But there is a definitions page on page 46, which I find useful just to refresh yourself on what some of the definitions are and some of the acronyms and so on. And then from 48 to 52, there is the data. And again, it's split down into the 5 subsections below: primary, secondary, and then maths split between small, medium and large. And you can see there the difference in pupil numbers for each section, just to allow you to better benchmark your trust against other like-minded, like-sized academies. Next page, please. So the highlights, so I suppose this is the spoiler alert page, and I'll move through this reasonably quickly because we go into lots more detail later on, but huge operational challenges. I think probably everyone on the call is aware of the challenges in the sector for many, many different reasons, and we'll pick those up on the next slide, but there's clearly uncertain times. The benchmark data shows that there has been an increase in income, which may surprise some people, but again, we'll go into more details. There is a large surpluses across many academy trusts, and as a result, free reserves have increased in many cases. We've also interestingly seen for the first time an increase in GAG pooling, particularly on larger maths, and trusts are expecting to take on more schools, and again we'll look into that in more detail as we move along. Centralisation has always been a hot topic, and we're seeing more and more of that throughout the year. But I suppose that's what we're seeing right now, and the final bullet point is forecasting the next 3 years. And I think in many cases we are actually seeing forecasted deficits. So perhaps a rosy picture right now, but three-year budgets and forecasts show a slightly different view. More on that later. Over to the next page, please. So challenges, I picked up there's operational challenges, but you know, just setting the scene, there's clearly other challenges too. We're seeing uncertainty, not only in funding, but across the social, political world, as we all know, crisis in Ukraine and so on, is having an impact across the globe, and schools are not immune to that. Energy costs clearly is a huge cost within schools. Schools are big buildings, as you're all aware, and the costs are very high and will continue into the future. Clearly, the government have given some support, albeit limited in terms of time frame. This is going to be an ongoing issue for schools. Staff costs are likely to continue to rise, and that's linked to the inflationary pressures below. So not only will staff costs rise, but other non-staff costs are likely to rise as well. Staff welfare and burnout has been on the horizon now for a number of years and continues to be. And we're starting to see anecdotal evidence of vacancies within the sector, finding it hard to replace teachers and so on, which perhaps is a reflection on the staff burnout. And I suppose that leads to strike action, again, partly as a result of staff burnout, but also staff pay rises not being deemed to be sufficient amongst a number of teachers and non-teachers across the sector. And then political instability. I'll try not to be political here today, but will we have a Labour government in the future? What will the next government look like, and what impact that would have on the sector? Over to the next page, please. So let's get into the data, and let's start with financial position. As I mentioned, the sector is actually in quite robust financial health, which perhaps goes against some of the messaging that comes out. We are seeing large surpluses. Towards the right of the page here, we have some data, and you can see there's some pretty large surpluses, particularly at the larger mat size. So we are seeing a continued in-year surplus. But budgeting, as I've mentioned, is difficult, and going forward will continue to be so. But even little example, well, I shouldn't say little because it wasn't a little example of pay rises being announced from the DfE quite late in the day in July, and how that was not reflected in many budget forecasts that were submitted due to timing. But clearly going forward, as I've already mentioned, forecasts are going to be tight, and I think free reserves will start to be eaten up. There is additional funding expected on the horizon. I think Jeremy Hunt announced a 2.3 billion increase in funding that's spread over a couple of years, but by 24-25, it's expected to amount to about £1,000 a pupil, which is certainly not insignificant. So hopefully that will come through to fruition. Next page, please. So within the benchmark report, there are a number of surveys that were asked, and one that I thought was interesting and is similar to a comment I've just been making is one of the survey questions was, based on your 3-year budget, are your total revenue reserves at the end of year 3 predicted to be? And the 3 answers were lower, stay the same, or higher. And you could see there 88% of individuals surveyed felt that they would be lower, probably because of all the challenges that I raised earlier: energy costs, inflationary pressures, and funding, although going up, is limited. I thought it'd be interesting to raise a poll here today to see whether the viewers today represent the wider survey, or whether there's any new messaging coming out, particularly since we're a couple of months on from when this survey was asked. I believe it was asked in November, December time. We're now in February, to see whether anyone has any different views. So I will raise the poll or present the poll now. So again, based on your 3-year budget, are your total revenue reserves at the end of year 3 predicted to be lower, stay the same, or higher? So I'll just give you a few moments there to consider and to answer that. Okay, well, if you wouldn't mind, shall we close the poll there? Wow, so we're seeing a very clear lower. So if anything, it's actually become clearer that we're expecting forecasts to show a deficit, and therefore we'll see reserves being eaten up over a number of years. Thank you. Can we close that poll? Thank you. So on to the next slide, please. So I am going to take a break from talking now, and I'm going to hand over to Becky, who's going to talk through some of the other areas within the benchmarking report, starting with income. Over to you, Becky.
Thanks, Darren. So to start off with, we're looking at a GAG, and the results that we looked at in the benchmarking report showed that GAG as a proportion of total income is currently sat at around 75%, which is an increase of around 1% on the prior year. And I guess the increase in GAG has been driven by the government announcements of like the additional 4.7 billion of core funding, of which $1 billion of that was received in the financial year just gone. And therefore, we should continue to see the high levels of GAG in the future years due to this additional funding. And then with that said, the government previously committed to try and return this core funding back to kind of 2010 levels. So this current level of increase is quite encouraging that it's hopefully starting to go in the right direction. With capital income, our data shows that the civ income has increased in the year from 434 million to around 483 million. However, the number of projects has decreased, noting that there has been kind of a shift in the values of the projects undertaken. And in addition, the SCA funding has also increased from around 1.24 billion to 1.58 billion. But capital funding can be unpredictable and will generally vary year on year depending on the grants awarded from the ESFA. There is currently an increased requirement to invest in capital assets due to the energy cost pressures being faced and the need to improve energy consumption in the current facilities being used. However, with that said, a lot of schools are experiencing building project delays due to the lack of labour and materials. So this has kind of had a knock-on effect on the trust carry-forward reserves due to not being able to complete the projects in the initial agreed timescale. So it's kind of moving on into additional years. And then looking at kind of other income / COVID income. So the data again shows that trading income has increased to around 3% of total income, which we haven't really seen since before the pandemic. And then to compensate for the reduced trading income and the impact that COVID has had on schools, the academies are still being provided with around 7.8 billion of additional funding. However, this is through various different kind of support packages. But trusts are going to have to continue to consider looking at ways of increasing this other income to help support any changes in grant income and the increased cost pressures over the next few years. However, with that said, that this should be taken with caution because the increased trading activities potentially could generate VAT in corporation tax issues that may not have been noted before. And then finally, on future funding considerations, the government has been somewhat proactive in announcing a number of extra grants that will be made available over the next few years. One being the 2.3 billion awarded to the additional core funding, and then 447 million of capital funding to help with these making schools more energy efficient, etc. Next slide, please. So moving on to staff costs, as you'll know, staff costs will still remain the largest cost for the sector, and as a percentage is still in the region of about 74% of total costs. The average staff costs have increased across all trusts, which is not unexpected due to kind of the teacher pay rises and the backdated pay for support staff. Further to this, with the government announcement in July 22, we are also expecting an additional teacher pay increase for the 22-23 year of between 5 and 8.9%, with the objective of moving in line with the government plans to try and increase the new teacher salary to around 30,000. with the view to attract new staff to the sector. However, based on the review of the teacher training programs, it still shows that secondary school training places are still falling short of the targeted levels that they're trying to achieve. And then the average gross teacher salary has increased in the year between 8 to 14%, which again has been driven by the agreed pay increases. There has been a steady increase in head teacher and CEO salaries, with the largest increase noted in maths, which is unsurprising given the growth of some of the maths over the last couple of years and the increased responsibilities that this faces. So although it's good to note that the senior roles aren't being increased beyond the rest of the teaching staff, it is important the Trust is still adhering to the ESFA guidance for setting executive pay, and the pay increases being agreed can be justified. And then the CFO salaries in the sector have seen increases in the year of around 14%, mainly in the secondary SATs and maths. There has been a shortage of appropriate finance professionals in the sector, and long wait times to actually recruit staff into the roles, which has played a factor of these increased costs in the current year. And then finally, on supply costs, Schools Weekly recently reported the supply teachers have almost doubled since pre-pandemic, and can be evidenced in the increased costs that the academies are experiencing in the current year, with primary SATs being the worst affected by not having the ability to draw on other departments to fill gaps when required. So with that said, Trust will need to start looking at implementing strategic plans to better cover these staff absences to help reduce these increased costs being experienced. Next slide, please. So then moving on to non-staff costs, we've seen a full period of kind of normal activities now with no COVID restrictions in place, and therefore the associated costs returning to a normal level. However, academies are now facing the rising cost pressures with little opportunity to control/cut any of these costs. So the most uncertain non-staff cost at present relates to energy, and due to the timings of increases, the trusts are yet to experience a full year of these impacted increases. In addition, there are also the trusts are also worried that the energy contracts that are coming to the end of the current financial year and the new rates that they're going to have to sign up for. And based on our data, the largest increase was noted in a primary SAT this year, with an increase of energy costs of around 45%, which is huge, really. However, in September 22, the government did announce an energy relief bill, which was automatically applied to energy bills, which will run through until March 23, and a further scheme has been announced, which will continue on to April 24. However, this scheme isn't as generous. Therefore, trusts will have to start putting together strategic plans to try and cover these increased bills after the date where grants, etc., are stopped, and will likely result in trust needing to invest in capital spend to help improve the energy consumption in the current facilities. And then the final other main cost increase relates to food costs, with statistics showing an upward rise of about 14.5% on the prior year. Primary SATs are feeling the cost pressures the most, with an average increase in the year of about 20%. And based on the surveys currently undertaking, it suggested that the grant funding through the universal free school meals did not cover the cost increases being experienced. Therefore, trusts are going to start having to look at ways of reducing these by trying to seek alternative food choices, or trying to bulk buy to obtain additional discounts. Moving on, please. And then my final section looks at the balance sheet. So the level 3 reserves has increased on average at a trust level, and trusts will want to try and retain these level of reserves, and the increased reserves in the current year will also hopefully cushion any short-term financial issues that are currently being faced at the moment, i.e. the heightened inflation, the pay increases and the energy increases. Trusts also will be concerned of any potential impact in kind of changes in political parties, although obviously nothing confirmed yet. But during schools weekly, it suggested that the reserves should be proportionate for all schools, but it wasn't kind of clarified of how this would actually be put into practice. Therefore, I guess there are risks of potential clawbacks in the future. And then looking at fixed assets, over the last couple of years, there has been significant spend in IT due to the need for this equipment over COVID. However, trusts are now starting to focus on reducing energy consumption and how this can be achieved by improving current facilities. The government did pledge 500 million of additional funding, which can be used by trusts to invest in capital such as heating control, LED lighting, etc., to try and help with this. And therefore, it can be expected that the capital expenditure will remain high for a number of years to allow these larger energy projects to take place. And then in relation to pensions, all trusts will have seen a significant decrease in their LGPS liability on the balance sheet this year. This was driven by a change in bond yields, which led to movements in the discount rates. But whilst looking at the discount rate in comparison to the prior year may not have looked like it moved hugely, but even 0.1% can cause significant swings in the liability. However, it is important to note that even though it still will remain a larger balance on the balance sheet, there isn't any expectation that there will be immediate requirement to try and repay this deficit at all. And then in relation to future pension contributions, mainly TPS, there is currently a review undertaken of the new employer rates due to come into effect from April 24. The new rates haven't been confirmed, but rumours are suggesting the percentage could be around 30%, which again is another large increase. And therefore, consideration will need to be had when looking at kind of the future budgeting in the trust to make sure they can cover these costs. And that's all from me. So back over to Darren.
Thank you, Becky. So moving to multi-academy trusts and starting with the number of multi-academy trusts, you'll see there year on year, it's been very little movement actually. What's that? A slight reduction. However, we know a number of academies have continued to convert, or schools have continued to convert to academies. So logically, they're entering or coming into existing academy trusts. So we are seeing over a period of time that the number of schools within a MAT increasing, and the graph on the right-hand side does show that we've seen increases year on year, but with 2022 being the largest, it's clearly now that newly converted schools are finding homes within existing trusts. We're also seeing that GAG pooling is starting to increase, and quite a significant increase on last year. There was quite a slow uptake if you go back a number of years, and most academy trusts were allowing each school to maintain their own GAG and effectively run their own budgets. But I think now as the sector matures, we will continue to see an increase in GAG pooling. And I suppose that leads on to top slicing. And again, we're seeing that increasing, and perhaps that's part of the GAG pooling, and top slicing is the next step, essentially. Commonly 5% was seen as the average. It's starting now to creep beyond 5%. Why, I suppose, is the reason, or the question to ask. What inflationary pressures probably has a impact there. Are we seeing larger academy trusts centralise more services? Probably yes. Are larger academy trusts now investing on that central services team, professionalising it in terms of the central team? I would say yes again. So I think it's a mixture of many factors. Free reserves are increasing. We've mentioned that a number of times, and particularly in larger mats, we're seeing that. And I suppose a similar point, increased centralisation. We are seeing, as gag pooling's increasing, as top slice is increasing, that there are more central services. I think mats are now recognising the economies of scale, the synergies, the efficiencies, and also just the increasing consistency and quality that can be obtained by centralising some of the services. Next page, please. Next page, please, Georgia. Oh, yeah, sorry, took a little lag on my side. Okay, so governance. We all know how important governance is, and in challenging times, it becomes even more important. Governance professionals is something that the ESFA have been pushing quite hard, that having a clerk that just does minute taking is fine, but do you need something a little bit more than that? Should the governance professional have an advisory capacity? Should they be helping the trust make better decisions? We are seeing a bit of a skills gap in the governance professionals sector. There is a number of training courses available, and at the moment we're seeing the demand for governance professionals outstrip the supply. So perhaps over a period of time that will equalise. We're still seeing lots of messaging out from the ESFA that trustees should be challenging management, that it shouldn't be a passive role. You should be actively challenging management, and that's something I think the ESFA will continue to flag. Sorry, my lights have gone off here. So, know your board. There's been a lot of discussion around the composition of your board. From a skills point of view, ensuring that you cover off all the bases, whether it be HR, marketing, accounting, legal, and there are many others, and ensuring that you have a wide breadth of skills and experiences on there. Governance reviews can be used to assess the skills within your trust board, but can go much wider than that as well. The Academy Financial Handbook, probably 3 or 4 years ago, brought in the need to document in your governance statement within your accounts that you've carried out a review on a periodic basis. Most so far have been internal reviews, but there is an encouragement for more external reviews. Although external reviews are worryingly low, we're only seeing a very small percentage. I think it's something that trusts should consider, that if you're self-reviewing, although it's important to self-reflect, sometimes you will continue to come up with the same answers. Is it time to get an external professional body to carry out a review? I would leave that as a question for all trusts to consider. Yeah. And then diversity and the challenge that brings. There are some statistics that only 1% of trustees are under the age of 30. So it is an ageing board, and I think taking that a step further, I'll just have to look at my notes. 50% of the trust board tend to be over 60 years old. So I think there is a clear gap in terms of the experiences that might be there, and we understand the reasons why. They're volunteer roles, and perhaps people later in life have a little bit more time to carry out these fulfilling and important roles. But age is not the only defining criteria here. We are seeing a continued view that there are underrepresented parts of society that are still not on trustee bodies, and I think it is incumbent on trusts over a period of time to consider and reflect on that. The size of boards hasn't necessarily changed. If you look year on year, we're seeing very, very consistent outcome. I suppose there's no need for larger trust boards, but as MATs grow, you would expect boards to grow slightly. We are seeing vacancies at trustees level that are probably higher than they have been since 2015, for example. So we are seeing an increase in vacancies, and perhaps that's being flown through into the board size. Over to the next page, please. So this is our last slide, and I just wanted to finish with the challenges ahead. I think we mentioned a number of times some of the uncertainties within the sector and some of the challenges that will continue to face trusts. So within our surveys, as part of the benchmark report, we listed out the top challenges. We asked trusts to explain what their top challenges are and what their top strategic priorities are, and I thought it was just useful to list these down here. I'll only pick up on a few, but top challenges: balancing the budget. Again, goes back to our earlier comment around forecasting over the next 3 years. Top strategic priorities: ensuring a broad and balanced curriculum. Okay, clearly curriculum will always be high on the list, but there's other points there. Mental health and well-being, we mentioned, both on the pupil and the staff side, and ensuring the best use of resources, again, goes back to many of the financial points that we've discussed here today. Over to the next page, please. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We've included here our details. If you do have any questions, please do send those across, either on the live chat or to us individually. I've also included a couple of links there, one to our the Academy's part of our website, and secondly to the benchmarking report, which clearly includes a significant amount of additional information over and above the highlights we've covered off today. We are very short for time, so I'm not going to take too many questions, but there was one coming in that perhaps I glossed over earlier, but was a question around public finances and the impact that's likely to have on the academy sector. We don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not sure I can give you a full answer, but Rishi Sunak has made it pretty clear that education is very high up on his agenda. We've seen that backed up with Jeremy Hunt's pledge, as Becky mentioned, the 2.3 billion, but also the capital pledges that have been made. So there's clearly support for the sector, but I think most would believe it's been underfunded for a number of years. So it may take a long, hard slog to return to previous levels of funding per pupil, or real-term funding per pupil, I should say. So I think that brings us to the end. As I said, please do send your questions through, and we will endeavour to answer those in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope you've found that useful. Take care. Bye.